Okay, so we're looking at 3 minutes past the hour. So I think we'll just start and kick off now. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. This is the sixth webinar of our series so far, and it's the third one where we're focusing on our multi-market international research. So what's going to be different about this webinar today, however, is that we've arguably entered a bit more of a transitory phase with the crisis in a lot of markets, right, when it comes to the outbreak. So while most of our research so far has really focused on the acute crisis, we're now going to shift gears a little bit and shift our attention to what the transition period is going to start to look like. So definitely not normalcy, but something maybe in preparation for, I guess, the long road to normalcy is what we can call it. So before we kick off, just a couple of introductions. My name is Verna, and I'm a Strategic Insights Manager here at Global Web Index, based out of New York. And joining me from London is my colleague Katie, our Consumer Insights Manager.
Hi, everybody.
So also before we get started with the content, I want to mention that all of the research we'll be discussing today is freely available in the form of a white paper on our Coronavirus Content Hub. So you can access this directly from our website as well as on the link that's shown here. And there you'll be able to find blogs, white papers, and other additional studies that we've done all around the coronavirus outbreak. So I would encourage you to have a look if you find these insights interesting. Also, just in the interest of time, we're not going to be able to take any questions live right now, but if you do have questions during this webinar, please email them to trends@globalwebindex.com, and we will get back to everybody as thoroughly as we possibly can.
Cool, thanks for that, Verna. So on the agenda for today, we'll be looking at consumer perspectives during this transitory phase through a few different themes that we've seen crop up, and really examining how those themes manifest across all kinds of verticals and industries. First, we'll be looking at the financial consciousness that's starting to take hold of a lot of consumers right now. And then we'll dig into the idea of safety, which is shaping our plans to return to all kinds of public venues and a return to travel in the next phase. Next, we'll look at convenience and how the types of services that we've become accustomed to during the crisis are creating a stronger demand for convenience in our everyday lives, even after this is over. And lastly, as usual, we'll wrap it up with some key takeaways and give you all a bit of insight into the future studies to look out for.
Great. So, but before we dive right into the research, we just want to give you all a brief overview into who we are here at Global Web Index, just so you have a sense of our research, our methodology, and really where this data is coming from. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, Global Web Index is a market research company that provides consumer insight to leading brands, marketing agencies, and media organizations worldwide. It's home of the world's largest ongoing survey on the digital consumer, and we actually have the largest panel of consumers globally at 22 million people across 46 different markets. And this research is representative of an internet population of around 2 billion people. We make this data available through an intuitive subscription-based platform, allowing teams to dive in and cross-analyze their audiences to really understand their behaviors, their attitudes, their interests, their media touchpoints, and more across over 40,000 different touchpoints and data points.
And in addition to our main product, as Verna just mentioned, we also run a lot of dedicated custom research across all different types of topics and across many different markets. And the insights that we'll be discussing today were taken from a custom study that we ran recently across 17 global markets. For this study, we polled over 15,000 respondents aged between 16 to 64 in these markets. Fieldwork was conducted between April 22nd and April 27th. And this is actually the third global study that we've done on the coronavirus crisis so far. So we'll actually be referencing some figures from those two earlier studies as well to show patterns and changes in consumer behavior across these past 6 weeks or so. Right, so to kick things off, we're going to set the scene a little bit first and look at where we are now in terms of the coronavirus crisis cycle. And our overarching theme for this webinar and its analysis is around the transition period. And we're calling the phase we're at transitory right now because of how things have kind of leveled off when it comes to rates of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths in a lot of these markets, as well as the kind of consumer response to that leveling. So for example, between our first wave of research in mid-March and the second wave in April, we saw really big jumps in overall concern levels. Now, however, though, we've seen stabilizations and even slight declines in concern levels. It's by no means a return to normalcy, rather a movement from the acute phase of panic to a more longer term stage of transition. And this could last a couple of months, or as some disease experts suggest, could be as long as 2 years if no vaccine is developed and nations continue to get hit with seasonal waves of this virus.
Cool, thank you for that context, Katie. So now to get into some of the more concrete insights during the transitory phase, we'll look first at this data through the idea of financial consciousness, or perhaps even penny pinching, as some might call it, that's characterizing a lot of consumer attitudes and behaviors both now and into the near future. So we're seeing a greater awareness of the financial situation, both personally and economically at a higher level since the first wave of our research. As part of this new stage of the crisis, we're really seeing consumers tightening their belts or preparing to tightening them pretty soon. So we've commented in previous webinars how there's been a bit of a gap between how people see the outbreak affecting the global economy versus affecting them personally. But it increasingly appears like consumers are more aware of how this is going to affect them personally. So 43% of consumers now believe that the outbreak will have a big or dramatic impact on their personal finances compared to 31% in wave one. So obviously there's also the uncertainty around the job market that's having a big impact here now as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I think one of the big overhanging questions around this crisis is to what extent we're going to see what's sometimes called revenge spending, where consumers who have been stuck indoors for quite a while are going to charge into stores and make use of the money that's been sitting in their account. Our data shows, though, that conservative prediction to spending, however, is likely more accurate.
Yep, so we found that 80% of consumers globally are planning to delay big purchases after the outbreak, and 41% are going to cut back even on their day-to-day spending. And a lot of people are looking to China for signs of this revenge spending, particularly as it's been such a booming market for many brands. But if we look at them for guidance in this case, they're actually some of the most financially conservative of all of the markets. So 82% in China will delay big purchases, and half will be reducing regular financial commitments on things like subscriptions. And China is actually ahead of most countries for wanting to delay big purchases. So if you wanted to look at high earners potentially as another group to lead revenge spending, there aren't many signs of that either among this audience. So top earners are just as likely to be planning to cut back on their day-to-day spending as those in the middle and the bottom income segments. We actually may have something similar going on to what followed the financial crisis in 2008, where conspicuous consumption is less trendy now, and there's this general feeling, whether it's completely accurate or not, that financial prudence has to lead the way. And it's important not to think of depressed spending as a purely economic thing. And I think 2008 showed us that it has a cyclical effect where it creates its own kind of trends in the marketplace. So there becomes a bigger focus on prudence, minimalism, bargain hunting, thrifting, all of these kinds of things. And again, looking at China, after 2008, the Chinese market was largely responsible for keeping up demand in luxury when the market was collapsing in the West. But in the current crisis, the effects seem to be even more profound in China. So there's not really a part of the world that can step in and replace that level of demand right now. So I think we're really seeing signs of consumers at least thinking much more conservatively about their spending.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously, the side effect of this is an emphasis on promotions and discounts as a strategy, with a third of consumers saying that they're looking at this before they begin spending. And it's something that has broad approval in the market too, with 81% saying they approve of brands running these kinds of promotional offers. So in this next slide, we're looking at which specific types of purchases have been delayed. Again, looking at luxury, you can see here a quarter are delaying purchases of luxury items, which shows that it's soon dropped from the consumer's list of priorities at a time like this. I don't think it's any huge surprise that flights and vacations are out on top here as well. I think for one thing, many of them have had to be cancelled for reasons that are beyond a consumer's control right now. And they're also a pretty big investment in their own right. What I do find quite striking though is that clothes are up there as well. To me, this shows that it's not just a case of big ticket purchases that are being delayed right now, as consumers are looking to kind of tighten up on any kind of non-essential spending. I think it also suggests that it's not simply a case of delaying purchases because the stores are closed either. I think even in the most optimistic scenario, e-commerce sales are going to, I don't think e-commerce sales are going to make up for the overall reduction in fashion and clothing purchases that we're seeing happening right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. On the point too about tightening up discretionary spending, one of the interesting things that's happened in China recently, to kind of reference it again, has been the distribution of government-sponsored coupons to get people going out and spending again. But recent reports have found that most people are actually using these coupons on groceries and essential purchases. So even with this big kind of push to spend, the mindset is proving really hard to shift.
Yeah, and just to quickly go back to luxury items, of this quarter who say they're delaying luxury purchases, 40% are waiting for promotions or sales before they can get their hands on what they're after. So to put it another way, only 15% say they intend to buy what they wanted at full price. Now, clearly discounting is an existential issue for a lot of luxury brands, and we don't want to suggest that panic discounting is the way to go here, but it's a pretty good sign of how demand will need to be teased back to these products, whether it's via discounts or whether it's via another strategy.
hmm Exactly. And I think there's another point worth making here as well. So one of the phrases you hear a lot around the crisis has been, we're all in it together. Now, I think it's highly debatable how true that is, especially when you see what sorts of environments high profile people and celebrities especially are able to self-isolate in. But there has been a widespread feeling of solidarity. And it's a feeling that when combined with more cutbacks in personal spending, is really going to have a profound effect on luxury. I do think that when social ties are being reshaped quite a lot, as in a crisis period, they always tend to be, it may be harder to market the kinds of products that rely on, distinguishing yourself from everyone else and emphasizing this idea of exclusivity in the way that luxury goods traditionally do. So moving into kind of a different category, we mentioned that revenge spending earlier, and how the number of people planning to delay big purchases shows that we might not really hear the tills ringing loudly again for a while. But at some point, consumers will go back to spending, right? And they'll have to be making decisions about what they buy first, and that's what we're going to be looking at now.
Yeah, and just to give a little bit of guidance on how to read the data here. So we're looking at the most prioritized purchases after delay in spending. And the figures that each category is based on is those who've said that they're buying, or sorry, that they're delaying to buy that category of product. So at the top, what we're seeing is that 54% of consumers who have delayed buying a smartphone will make it their priority purchase after the outbreak.
For sure. And there's two reasons to do this when it comes to how we've shown the data. So one is that so we can account more for the size of each market. And two, also just to push this prioritization aspect a bit more. So if someone's delaying 5 purchases, let's say, which is really going to be the most important to them?
Exactly. And we've talked quite a bit about luxury already, but notice how luxury is actually at the bottom here. So again, when it's all said and done, this really isn't going to be a big priority buy for people when some more normal shopping behaviors start to resume.
And I think that the top of the list is pretty telling. So you can see that many of these highly prioritized purchases are related to technology and electronics. So things like smartphones, home appliances, and personal electronics. And this is really going to show where spending is going to be concentrated as lockdowns start to ease. And this is important definitely for anticipating demand.
Yeah, it's also quite interesting that smartphones are at the top because, as we've seen, what is the biggest contraction in the global smartphone market's history in the last quarter, anyways. I think our main takeaway from this has to be that consumers may well be in the market for new phones, but I think with a drastically revised budget to do so. Apple's new budget phone, which is the new iPhone SE, it came out recently, and I think it will be a very interesting one to watch as it may show us what sort of smartphones will be top of mind for consumers as they emerge from the crisis.
So now we've already alluded to discounting and the role that it will play in provoking spending after the crisis, but price isn't everything, and that's something we want to talk about here. So there's already been a lot of discussion, some of it in this webinar, about using 2008 and the last global economic slowdown as kind of a playbook to try and claw back consumer spending. But doing this could overlook some of the unique aspects of the current situation, which we get a picture of in this slide. So in this slide, we're looking at what types of brands and what sort of brand behaviors will be rewarded with consumer spending after the outbreak. And the data here shows that this is more than just a straightforward recession, if there really is such a thing. So most of the research we do here at GWI, and most of it we see that consumers are typically very price sensitive, and with good reason. So if you ask someone if they want something cheaper, like who's gonna say no, right? And here we're seeing that 30% of people say that they will buy from brands with the cheapest prices after the outbreak. But it's far from the most popular option. So you can see that it's going to be about more than just a race to the bottom. And we can tease out some of these subtleties in the emerging consumer mentality.
Yeah, that's right. And I think these options at the top are quite telling of that. So at the top, the most favored brands to spend on are those which meet a consumer's needs, which I think shows how displaced a lot of consumers feel at the moment and the level of support that they feel that they need. And following that, we also have those with the best product availability, which shows consumers are feeling these pressures on supply chains, seeing a lot of products that are being sold out, as I'm sure we all have, and are looking around for healthy stock levels. And then in third place, we have something quite interesting, and it's brands that have helped people during the crisis. We've mentioned this in previous content of ours, and it's one of the interesting side effects of the crisis. And it definitely feels like for the past few weeks, it feels like a good number of consumers have been acting like Santa Claus in a way, making lists of who's been naughty, who's been nice, and maybe who gets rewarded accordingly.
Definitely. And you see that again if you want to look at China as a market kind of further along in the path, and one that might give us a bit of guidance and insight as to the future of other markets. They are again out in front for rewarding brands that pitched in during the crisis and kind of lended a helping hand to consumers. Now, there's a very different structure to society in China that obviously is going to play a role in that, but it shows just how important it is to be proactive and supportive of consumers at this time. I don't think that going dark and just sitting things out and waiting for people to naturally come back is going to be much of a valid strategy at this point.
Great. So next up, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how safety has become absolutely crucial for consumers at this time. It's a theme that's increasingly popping up in our research as we've slowly moved to a new phase of the virus. And it's definitely something that really underpins consumers' behaviors and their future intentions, most notably when it comes to travel, which is something that we'll cover more in the next section. So across the world right now, we're seeing countries move from the initial acute or shock phase to one of transition, one where lockdowns are restricting or are easing, even in the most hard hit countries. So for example, in Italy, which is the worst hit country in Europe to date, they've even slowly eased restrictions, allowing over 4 million workers to return to work after a very long time of lockdown, around 7 weeks. And in the UK this week, we're set to see its roadmap to unlock the economy. But does this mean consumers will want to quickly resume normal activities? And from our data, we found that most consumers, understandably, are not in a big hurry to return to public spaces. So as you can see here, 47% of consumers say they'll wait for some or a long time before visiting shops. And this jumps up to 59% for outdoor venues like sports stadiums and music festivals, and then even higher again to 64% for indoor venues like sports arenas, concert halls, and cinemas.
That's right. So we're definitely seeing a great degree of caution among consumers. We found that the preference to wait for some or a long time to visit indoor venues increases to 60% or higher across 10 of our key markets. It reaches a high of around 70% in China and South Africa. And there's also similar sentiment for visiting outdoor venues, and the level at which consumers say they prefer to wait to visit these types of venues reaches 60% or more in 9 of our markets, with a peak again in South Africa at 70%. And it only dips as low as 47%, and that's in Brazil. So this all shows that big indoor and outdoor venues especially will face a much tougher battle in getting consumers back on their grounds, even when they do reopen as we enter kind of a new normal at some point.
Yeah, it's certainly no easy feat. I mean, that's for sure. But that being said, even though most consumers say they would prefer to hold back and wait before returning to busier public spaces, there are still a pretty big chunk of consumers who are willing to take the plunge more quickly, especially when it comes to visiting shops. So around a third of consumers say they would like to visit shops quite or very quickly, compared to just under 1 in 5 for indoor venues. And when we look at it by generation, we can see that younger Gen Z are more likely to say they'll return to shops immediately or quickly than their older counterparts. So a third of Gen Z say this, compared to 1 in 5 of baby boomers.
So the desire to return to shops obviously differs by generation, but it differs considerably by market as well. And here we've outlined some of the big country differences for visiting shops quickly versus those who would prefer to wait for some time or for a long time. And overall, we see that Australia and the UK are the two biggest markets for wanting to return to shops quickly. Close to half of Australians say this, compared to just a quarter of those who would prefer to hold off. Now, at first glance, it seems like the markets that are most eager to return to visiting shops are those that maybe haven't seen as big of spikes in infections compared to other countries. And this is certainly the case in Australia, Singapore, and Ireland, who haven't really experienced the very kind of profound effects that we've seen in markets like Italy, for example. And saying that though, the outlier in this scenario appears to be the UK, which to date is actually the fourth hardest hit country in the world in terms of infection rates, and it has the third highest mortality rate. So we can only assume that the appeal of normalcy and being able to visit shops and do of our more of our kind of usual activities is much greater here among UK consumers than those in other similarly affected countries.
Yeah, and on the other side of the spectrum, we've got Italy, Brazil, China, and Spain, who are out on top for preferring to wait for some or quite a long time. So over half in Italy say they prefer to wait to visit shops, compared to 1 in 4 who want to visit quickly. And this sentiment makes sense considering the impact the virus has had on Italians, and the same can also be said for Spain as well. While for other markets like Brazil and the Philippines, it's likely that there's a higher degree of caution more generally there, rather than it being a direct result of the virus's impact in those markets.
Yeah, and what I found quite interesting is that even in a market like China, which has been in the transitory phase longer than other markets, more than half of consumers here say that they would prefer to wait for some time or quite a long time to visit shops. So this shows that even in markets that are, opening up again, there's still a very strong degree of wariness, perhaps because there's no long-term solution yet, like a vaccine, or, the threat of a second wave of the virus actually does feel very real to a lot of people.
And in other public spaces and out of home leisure activities, which we all, I'm sure we really enjoy doing, they're also set to see a more longer term impact as well. So we can see that 42% of global consumers say they intend to eat out at restaurants less often, and 31% say they'll eat at fast food outlets less often and visit cinemas less often when restrictions are lifted. This, of course, opens up more opportunities for in-home entertainment and food delivery, so it's not all doom and gloom. And this is actually something that we'll explore a bit more later on.
Exactly. And I think consumers' reluctance to eat out or visit cinemas is mainly because of safety concerns, as you touched on quite a bit. So it remains almost impossible, obviously, to socially distance in restaurants, cinemas, bars, pubs, especially. They're busy, high volume public spaces with many people crammed together, coming and going. So the chance of transmission in these places is naturally going to be very high. So it's no wonder that many consumers are expecting to adapt their behaviors. And it'll be interesting to see what that kind of looks like once we are able to return to some degree to these sorts of public spaces.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes sense why consumers feel the way that they do right now. However, I think it's also worth noting that not all markets feel the same way. So, for example, dining out less reaches a peak of 54% in India, followed by 48% in South Africa and 47% in China. However, in comparison, only 16% of consumers in Japan and 19% in France say they'll eat out less. And in general, we found that consumers in Japan, Australia, France, and Germany are most inclined to select none of the above here as an option. And this actually reached a peak of 75% in Japan. So it shows that people in certain markets aren't as likely to change their behaviors and are actually more inclined to want to return to normal when the time is right.
Mhm. And when we look at it by generation as well, we can see that younger generations, especially Gen Z, are the most likely to say that they'll do less of the different leisure activities compared to boomers. So, for example, 46% of Gen Z say they'll dine out at restaurants less often compared to 35% of boomers. And they're almost twice as likely as boomers to say that they'll eat out at fast food outlets less often. And the one activity where generations seem to be more closely aligned is when it comes to visiting bars and pubs, with all generations expressing a fairly similar level of concern and caution.
So one of the biggest areas where safety is becoming really fundamental right now is in travel. I mean, we're seeing this in the news every day right now. And we really can't overstate the impact the virus has had on the travel industry, from everything to hotels to Airbnbs and of course to flights. And from our data, we can see that purchases of vacations or trips continues to be the most delayed category since wave one of our research, overtaking categories like clothing, smartphones, and luxury items. And right now, 52% of global consumers say they've delayed purchasing a vacation or trip. This figure peaks at close to 60% in markets like China and Singapore, as well as among higher income earners at 62%.
That's right. And across all three waves of our research, we've seen consistent increases in delayed vacation purchasing across all of the markets. And we've seen some really big spikes in certain markets as well. So, for example, in France, delaying purchases of vacations grew from 28% in mid-March to 48% in mid-April. And in the US, it's jumped up from 30% in our first wave of research to 49% now. And by generation, delaying vacations is fairly consistent across all age brackets, reaching a peak of about 55% among millennials and only dropping to about 47% among Gen Z and 49% among boomers.
There does appear to be some light at the end of the tunnel, though, as vacations are still front of mind for many consumers. So globally, 23% of internet users say they will prioritize purchasing vacations or trips, making it the number one category overall. And booking a vacation is top priority for nearly all surveyed markets, apart from India, where buying consumer goods such as clothes and personal electronics has a greater appeal, and in South Africa, where consumers are more than twice as likely to prioritize buying clothes and a vacation.
Yeah, there's also an age pattern at work too. So the older the consumer, the more likely they are to prioritize booking a vacation. While 29% of baby boomers prioritize booking a vacation, this falls to just 18% for Gen Z. The latter are more inclined to prioritize clothing at 25% and smartphones at 20%. So this suggests that older consumers could be a key target for travel providers, at least initially. And among vacation delayers specifically, 45% of this audience say that they will prioritize booking a vacation or a trip. And this rises to 72% among vacation delayers in Japan and 67% among delayers in the UK. So this is all, at least some positive news, and it really speaks to the importance of vacations when it comes to consumers' future plans after this kind of crisis stage and the transitory stage.
Exactly. It's also worth highlighting that while consumers want to go on holiday again, getting on a flight is not really what they have in mind. So we found that while 23% of internet users will prioritize purchasing a vacation after the outbreak, just 8% say the same of booking a flight. And this again is mostly due to safety concerns because, as we know, it's near impossible to socially distance in airports and airplanes. If you think about it, airplanes are designed in a way that maximizes efficiency and makes use of space. So, I mean, it doesn't seem very conducive to social distancing. There's also been a general assumption among consumers that one's own country is outperforming the global average. And so travelers likely feel safer staying within their own country's borders than booking a flight abroad. And this has actually given rise to a demand in domestic travel, which we'll explore shortly.
So it's definitely not as simple as just reopening borders and allowing people to travel again. Safety has become absolutely vital for consumers, and it's something that airlines, airports, and just the wider travel industry in general will have to really carefully consider moving forward. So when we asked consumers what would give them confidence to start traveling again, a feeling of safety was the top option across all markets and all demographic splits. At 58%, a personal feeling of safety is by far the biggest reassurance for all consumers, reaching 65% among boomers. And among vacation delayers specifically, this sentiment also increases to 65%. So safety trumps any other measures that we've listed, and it's almost double that of the other options given, including the government's lifting lockdown or stay-at-home restrictions, as well as any sort of travel advice being provided by the government.
Yeah, and we can see that just 28% of consumers say that countries reopening their borders would give them confidence to travel again. And this is likely because this action doesn't really offer any kind of reassurance, especially when it comes to safety. There are some market differences, though. For example, travel advice from the government spikes to around 40% in markets like Singapore, Australia, India, and the UK, and drops to a low of 11% in Italy. So these more tangible measures, shall we say, will have an impact on some consumers in certain markets, but it's really the feeling of safety that consumers are after. And this might manifest itself in many different ways, such as health screening at airports or travelers being asked to wear face masks, for example.
Yeah, and we've already seen many big airlines begin to implement some kind of safety measures. So, for example, American Airlines and United have said that they will start requiring passengers and crew members to wear masks on their flights. And in many airports in Asia, especially, they're already carrying out pre-flight temperature checks. Other measures include major pre-flight cleaning, and some airlines like EasyJet in the UK have said that they'll keep the middle seat free to try and leave as much distance between passengers as possible. Although that's been a bit contentious, as it still doesn't really leave enough space between passengers if you're thinking of that 6-foot radius that we're all kind of used to now. So as you mentioned, Katie, the whole efficiency of air travel is completely contradictory to social distancing.
Yeah, I completely agree there. I definitely think like wearing masks and increasing cleaning standards and like the regularity of cleaning is a necessary next step. I think especially in the short term, if airlines want to feel, to get people to feel more comfortable flying and offer some kind of peace of mind. Of course, the success of this really does depend on the effectiveness of these measures in the first place and also whether masks will even be available.
It's true. So it's clear that the future of travel will be centered around staying close to home, at least initially. Our data found that 31% of global consumers say that they expect to have more staycations or trips in their local area, and 29% plan to take more vacations within their own country. So domestic travel is definitely hot on the agenda, especially in China and among high earners is what we're seeing. And its popularity in China is pretty huge given the fact that, the Chinese traveler is really considered kind of a huge outbound traveler target market that the industry is often, trying to target and to get to travel to their attractions.
Yeah, that's right. And from our core global research in Q4 2019, we found that 64% of internet users in China holiday abroad at least once every 6 months, making them the second most likely country to do this out of the 46 countries that we track. And right now, having more staycations and domestic travel reaches a peak in this market at 42% and 30%, 37% respectively. China is ahead of other countries, as we know, in its journey with COVID-19. So I think China's travel concerns might be foreshadowing the extent to which other countries' behaviors are likely to change.
hmm And our findings here are also supported by some recent research from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which found that many Chinese consumers are turning to domestic vacations instead of the typical vacations abroad. So according to this report, Wuhan, which is the hardest hit city during the coronavirus outbreak, as we know, is actually at the top of wish lists for travelers who said that they want to contribute to the economic development in the region following the epidemic. And while domestic travel might affect airlines as less people are traveling internationally, it still does present a lot of opportunities for other components of the travel industry, from experiences, hotels, and Airbnbs, to car rentals. So the travel industry, especially airlines, really have a monumental task on their hands to get people traveling again. But looking at incorporating safety measures where possible will be an important first step to get travelers on board again. Cool. So switching gears a little bit now, next up we'll be looking at another one of the recurring themes that we're seeing across different topics and industries as consumers really move into this transitory phase. And this is the heightened demand for convenience. Now we've become more demanding of convenience as consumers for quite some time now. But the way in which we've lived for these last couple of months, with online shopping and food delivery, and basically rolling out of bed to go to our morning meetings in some cases, not all, has really reinforced this type of thing. And there's likely to be some lasting implications, which we're going to talk about now.
Yeah, so the most obvious place we're seeing this long lasting impact of convenience is shopping. So we know from our research that people have been shopping online more since the outbreak. And that's something that most consumers expect to last within their behavior patterns post outbreak. The number one shopping oriented behavior actually is ordering more items for home delivery at 40%. And this far surpasses buying goods for in store collection at 22%, which really suggests that it's not just the variety and ease of online shopping that is getting people, but it's the convenience that we've become used to.
Absolutely. And I think that looking at this by various audiences will give us some indication as to why this is so powerful and why we expect it to have a lasting impact. So the fact is that even among an audience who would not typically be your target online shopper, these people are still predicting that they're going to be using more home delivery post-outbreak. And self-expressed premium buyers, for example, are one good way to look at it. These are the people who tend to buy more premium versions of a product, and they're even more likely than average to say that they're going to be buying more for home delivery in the future, indicating that there's very much a space for higher end and potentially luxury goods here to really tap into. Not just your standard kind of Amazon purchases of like yoga mats and cutting boards and mugs and things like that. And luxury is one of those industries that has been much, much slower to migrate to e-commerce. So perhaps this crisis is going to accelerate that movement because, even premium buyers want more convenience at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure. Another really telling insight into this, which really emphasizes what a sticking point convenience in shopping will be, is that eco-conscious consumers are also more likely than average to say that they'll be ordering more for home delivery. And this really contradicts the ethos of ethical consumerism, I would say, considering that the whole industry of e-commerce and delivery is not really sustainable. There's so much wasted packaging, you've got people abusing free delivery and return services all the time, and of course the carbon footprint of all those deliveries in the first place.
Yeah, and we definitely see this kind of inconsistency with consumers, especially when it comes to thinking about something in abstract versus when it really affects you. Like, of course, it's, really important for a lot of people that their favorite brands use an ethical supply chain or sustainable ingredients. But at the end of the day, consumers are always going to do what's convenient and what's best for them. So it's hard to see behavior that really reflects these types of abstract ideals. So e-commerce is one very obvious place where we're seeing this demand for convenience come through. And another one is exercise. So we talked a bit about this during our last webinar, looking at the consumer impact from a health perspective. And while that research looked only at the US and the UK, our international data validates and actually further builds upon this at-home exercise trend that we're seeing and that we're really gonna expect to kind of last.
Yeah, so in our previous research revealed that a huge number of people were exercising at home more frequently through things like streaming exercise classes. And many of them, especially millennials, said they were planning to continue doing so in the future after COVID isolation. Our latest study takes this one step further, I would say. So we found that over 40% of people and nearly 50% of those who were used to going to the gym regularly before COVID said that they plan to continue exercising at home more frequently after the crisis.
Right, and that's really significant that potentially half of gym goers are saying that they'll be exercising more at home even when the gyms reopen. And it has big implications for the fitness industry. And those implications really focus around convenient alternatives, things like live streaming classes. So without adapting to this kind of new convenient fitness culture, gyms very well may risk having some of their clients actually cancel memberships, at least in the initial post-COVID-19 return. And it's the most committed gym goers that are actually the biggest potential flight risk. So people who were going to the gym most days a week pre-COVID-19 are actually 55% more likely than average to say that they're going to cancel their membership, and 39% more likely than people who said they were only going 2 to 3 times a week.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be pretty big implications for gyms and fitness clubs, as you say, Verna. I think even bigger implications there could be potentially is seen in the workplace. So I know that we've talked about a bit this in previous research, but this is the first time that we're really delving into the work from home idea with some international analysis. And as you can see, the sense that people will want to continue working from home more frequently is quite widespread.
That's right, Katie. So about 1 out of 4 consumers worldwide say that they plan on working from home more post-crisis than they did pre-crisis. And for certain industries, the rates are even higher. So for example, 35% of those who work in IT or software or telecommunications say that they'll be working from home more, while 32% of those who work in larger companies, which for the purpose of this analysis, we defined as companies with 1,000 employees or more, are saying that, as well as 31% of those who work in purchasing or procurement say that they're going to be doing that more.
Yeah, this has really big implications for B2B industries like tools and software providers who are designing products for the workforce. So I think understanding which industries are likely to see the biggest shifts to full on remote working on a more permanent scale, like IT workers or those in procurement, for example, will help them strategize for developing and marketing solutions to the right audiences.
Absolutely. So this convenience angle for B2B is really striking. And of course, it's wrapped up with other major elements like productivity, efficiency, et cetera. But it's just kind of another place where we're seeing this theme. Another area I wanted to touch on where we see this theme of convenience is around home delivery of food. So we know that home delivery and takeout has obviously become hugely popular during the crisis because dine-in restaurants are closed. What's likely to happen in the future, however, is that home delivery apps will continue to be quite popular because of how much convenience and choice that they offer, as well as their increased ability to cater to specialty audiences and dietary preferences, like vegans, vegetarians, all of this type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And we can start to see this trend take root with this data. Not only are 21% of global consumers saying that they're going to continue to use food delivery apps more frequently post the crisis, but an even higher number of restaurant goers, so people who would normally be dining out once a week or more, say they'll be doing this at 28%. What's more, 30% of fast food consumers are also going to be doing this.
Yep, and this coincides with the fact that both restaurant goers and fast food consumers are more likely than average to be reducing their normal consumption patterns post the crisis, and probably because some of the risks that normal fast food and restaurant dining, inherently carries, which at this point people are quite concerned about, as we touched on in our section about safety. So we can see a bit of an opportunity forming here for dining apps and services to become really well established under normal conditions.
Yeah, and another really important factor that's likely going to lead to their growth is the fact that now the majority of major food delivery apps cater to all sorts of tastes. So you're not limited by the menu of one restaurant anymore. And typically, vegetarians and especially vegans have had a really hard time with dining out and ordering delivery. But food trends have obviously changed, and this has been reflected in the offerings of delivery apps. So much so that what we're actually seeing is those with more diverse food tastes, like people with interests in vegetarian and vegan food, are even more likely than average to use more delivery apps in the future. And they're also more likely than average to be dining out less post COVID-19. And it might be that these audiences are really health conscious, as you might expect, and they will prioritize hygiene and sanitation over the experience of dining out in many cases, which again opens up a great opportunity for food delivery apps among more particular and somewhat niche audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that these types of apps are really here to stay and solidify themselves, even more in our lifestyle preferences. And it's going to mean that restaurants and bars have to adapt a bit to that future as well. So the hospitality industry is going to have to optimize for delivery as people have gotten so used to it. And ultimately, it's just kind of what they want more of.
Yeah, for sure. So another industry that's going to see a sustained shift to the convenience is the home environment, which is entertainment. So from our consistent research during the COVID crisis, we know that people have been spending a lot more time streaming content right now. And you don't even necessarily need research to tell you this. We've all been doing it in our homes. It's anecdotally understood at the moment. But is it going to last, or are we going to shift gears back to entertainment as it was before our social distancing measures are lifted? Well, according to consumers, there's a lot of benefit to having convenient entertainment, and that's likely to last.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Katie. Where we can see this emerging, especially, is by looking at a behavior like increased streaming, not only at a high level among all consumers, but among, this target entertainment audience, like we did with restaurant goers. So in this case, we can look at cinema goers, people who, under normal circumstances, would be visiting the cinema at least once a week. These people are more likely than average to be streaming more movies right now. And not only that, but they're also more likely than average to say that after the crisis is over, they're actually going to be going to the cinema less than they did before. So you have this impact being felt, even among the die-hard movie audience who are looking to potentially shift a bit more to streaming than before.
Yeah, that's really big. I think the film industry in some ways has been a bit snobbish to embrace streaming. Big box office films have always debuted in theaters traditionally, and industry awards like the Oscars and the Golden Globes don't really consider streaming films to be part of the mix. But that's all changing as well because it has to, or else no one will really make any money. So we've seen that in the way that Amazon Prime is now offering cinema debut films directly on the platform, but of course at an added extra fee.
Right. So this is something that's definitely going to change the way we think about film entertainment and film culture going forward. And in certain markets, the effect will be much more accelerated, I think. So in places like Japan, Germany, France, and a lot of the English-speaking markets like the US, UK, and Ireland, film buffs are significantly more likely than average to say that they're going to be watching more streaming and that they're going to be visiting the cinema less when things kind of return. So these are really the avid enthusiasts here, and their preferences are important in predicting the wider spread acceptance of a shift to streaming first film culture that looks like it may eventually happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we're also seeing something similar when it comes to live entertainment like concerts. So among their more core audience, so people who are interested in live events like concerts and festivals, there's actually a greater hesitancy than average to return to large indoor and outdoor gatherings, which is the exact environment of a concert or a festival. So this is also one area where we're seeing alternatives to real life events like virtual concerts. And these types of things are unlikely to be just a short-term solution to social isolation, but might actually have a niche space of their own in the new normal that develops out of this, whenever that might be.
That's a good point. So the last thing that I want to look at in this section is more of an audience analysis for a particular group that's been really benefiting from some of these convenience offerings, and that's parents with young kids. So parents with young kids, which we defined as those age 5 or younger, are more likely than average to say that they'll continue to do things like exercise at home more frequently, use more food delivering apps, and visit the cinema less often once things go back to normal. And a lot of the benefits for parents have been facilitated by technology, which is not only going to play a sustained role in entertainment, as we've seen, but in learning as well. So huge implications for education. Obviously, with schools being closed for so long, a lot of what kids are doing now is distance learning, most of which is mediated by technology. And we can see that this is set to have a really strong lasting impact, as the data shows us that parents are more likely to keep using online learning platforms versus books or audiobooks in the future, both for their own kind of continual learning as well as for their kids.
Cool. Thanks for that, Verna. So we've covered quite a lot today on the impact of coronavirus. So we're going to leave you all with a few key insights, as we always do, to wrap up this session.
Perfect. So all the insights just on the one slide. And first of all, we know that consumers are becoming more and more aware and more concerned about the personal financial impact of the crisis. And this is casting a shadow of financial conservatism over all types of purchases. However, cost isn't the only factor when evaluating brands to buy during and post-crisis. Social good is really important, is what we've seen, and consumers are nearly as likely to want to buy from brands that have helped people during the outbreak as those with good product availability. And we can look to China and other markets that are now over the curve to some extent to see an even greater propensity for this. So third, safety is really paramount when deciding when to re-enter public life, more so than government recommendations, much more so than government recommendations, especially in certain markets. And this means that industries wanting footfall to increase post-crisis will really need to get serious and vocal about their sanitation and distancing measures. So number 5, while travel may be the hardest hit industry, it has the potential to bounce back pretty rapidly once restrictions are lifted and safety issues kind of become more acceptable, because consumers desperately want to purchase vacations, especially over other delayed products is what we're seeing. So there is a demand for travel. It's just there's not an ability to do so yet. And talking about convenience, it's really become a way of life now and will have lasting impacts across industries like food and restaurants, entertainment, work, education, exercise, fitness, all of these. And lastly, technology has facilitated this in ways that caters to and appeals to even the most particular audiences. So we looked at film buffs and vegetarians and vegans, but there's plenty of ways to kind of analyze that. So, it really does solidify the kind of lasting power of some of these solutions, especially because technology has made them so accessible and so varied and, in a lot of ways, kind of cheaper than the alternatives.
Cool, thanks for the roundup there, Berna. So that about covers the content for this session, guys, and we'll do our best to answer any questions that you have via email. So for any questions that you haven't asked during the session, please direct them to our email, trends@globalwebindex.com. And all the information is on screen right now, and we will happily follow up with some detailed answers for you guys. And also keep an eye out on the content in the pipeline too, as we continuously produce new pieces of research and analysis. So we're planning to field at least 2 more additional multi-market waves of coronavirus research at the moment, which we anticipate will come in late May and mid-June, and more updates on this to follow. So please do keep in touch and watch this space for more.
And just as a last note, we'd really like to end this webinar on something positive, as we've been trying to do with all of our previous webinars. So obviously we're all in quite a lucky position here, as we're able to work from home and share this type of content with you all. But everything we've been talking about is obviously linked to a massive global health crisis that's affecting people's health and their ability to provide for their families. So we've just linked to a few charities here that are really helping to make a difference. The 3 on the screen now are Feeding America. If you're local to the States, this can help you find kind of food banks in your community to donate to. Buy the NHS a Pint for our folks in the UK to support their healthcare professionals, and Heart to Heart International, which has been providing personal protective equipment directly to the front lines. So these obviously don't cover anywhere near all of the amazing organizations that are helping with this cause, but they're just a couple of charities that are near and dear to us. So we would obviously love it if getting some of this insight actually inspired a few folks to get involved in whatever ways you guys can. So thank you so much for joining, everyone. That covers all of our content for the day. The recording of the webinar as well as the deck will be sent out pretty quickly. So thank you all. Hope you've enjoyed. Check out our content hub, and we hope to see you involved for the next webinar.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.